Intervals for violin players. When we talk about intervals, very often we talk about double stops. Double stops, it's when you're playing two notes together at the same time. Not all the time you have to think about intervals when you're playing double stops. It's a good idea to think about intervals in general because when we play violin, we don't see the keys. Like if you compare it to the piano players, you can actually see your keys, where to put your fingers. On the violin, we don't really see unless you have tapes in the beginning. Usually we start with that, and then we don't have tapes anymore. We have to really think about the distance between the notes. So that's when thinking in intervals comes handy. Well, let's start with the first one when we're talking about interval of a second. Interval of a second is just a step up or step down. For example, you have A and then the B, right? So that would be interval of a second, or stepping up or stepping down. Okay, so that's seconds, right? Interval of a second. What is interval of a third? A third, it's when you're skipping your fingers. For example, you have first finger, and then you have third, so that would be interval of a third. Very often when we play double stops, we use fingers. For example, we use, the third finger on D and first finger on A. So that's our third. That's how they sound. So these are thirds, and it's when you're using skips. Your fingers are skipping using 1, 3, 2, 4, like that. Let's move on. So the next one is interval of a fourth. Well, it's another skip. It's a wider skip, obviously. And then we're using again two note skip. That's your perfect fourth. I just played perfect fourth. The next video, part 3, is going to be about the quality of the intervals. Each interval can be a little bit bigger or smaller, so we'll talk about that. But for now, let's just say we're just playing a fourth, which has a certain quality in the sound. This interval for violin is especially tricky sometimes because it must be perfect. If it's not perfect, it's just so obvious you're not playing the right notes. So you have to really practice it when you're playing double stops, especially. It has a certain ring to it. So if it's perfect, it will sound perfect. If it's slightly lost, that's perfect. It lost a little bit some of that nice vibrancy. Okay, so the next interval is as tricky sometimes to play on the violin, but very, very important. It's an interval of a fifth. Interval of a fifth is actually we're using in order to tune our violin. So the distance between your strings, let's say between D and A, it's a perfect fifth. Again, you can count your names of the notes and you'll get to 5. So it's sometimes pretty tricky to play when you're using the same, like double stop, you'll have to use the same finger. You have to work until you can hear it sounds nice and vibrant. Perfect. And sometimes it's kind of hard, even if your violin, if it's just a little bit out of tune, your strings are not tuned well, you can hear it's going to sound a little bit off. So it must be perfect. Okay, the next interval is a sixth. Sixth, it's when you have space between the two notes is the 6 names of the notes, including the first and last one. So if you're playing double stops, it's usually using neighbor fingers. So for example, I'm using open D and first finger. The next one will be first and second. Then we're using 2 and 3. So it's always a little bit tricky to switch your fingers quickly to the lower string. So that's interval of a sixth. The seventh is kind of harsh sounding interval. So if I say play with open D and I will play C note, you know, that seventh, it sounds pretty harsh. Now, as I told you before, our intervals can be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. So if I say C sharp, going to play C sharp, sounds even worse some ways. Okay, so it's that one step less than an octave or eighth. So and let's try the eighth. Eighth is the an octave. So okay, that's another perfect interval, which sometimes hard to match to get it literally nice and pure. So it requires extra work because you can easily hear if it's slightly out of tune. Okay, so usually it's open D, let's say, and third finger, or it's open A and third finger on E, or open G and third finger on D. So it has to be perfect. Now, if you're playing double stops, you would use 1 and 4. So if I start with open, then I put 1, you would have to shift up. So again, you're using 1 and 4. Okay, so these are the basic introduction to the basic intervals and double stops on the violin.